Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gaddy and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
Today we welcome Dr. Tracy Pearson, a popular regular court TV guest whose website line includes the line, "She makes sense out of the noise." In other words, she tries to help others understand what they didn't understand before and then change their perspective. To further this effort, she hosts a popular live show and podcast called Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy. She has also joined Dan Abramson's Law and Crime Network as a legal analyst. She has not one but two doctorates, one in education and the other in law. And we're pleased that she was able to join us today on Justice Counts. Now, here's Mark Bello.
Tracy, welcome. I'm pleased you could join us. I got an ambitious agenda.
I'm happy to be here, happy to answer your questions if I can.
This week we have two rather significant legal anniversaries. One is the anniversary of the Gideon versus Wainwright decision, and the other is the 30th anniversary of my cousin Vinny. But I wrote an article on both, and Gideon, to me, in our lifetime, is probably the most important Supreme Court decision we've had. I don't think this happens these days with this court. Do you think America has achieved equal justice yet? And do you think this court would respond to a petition like the handwritten Gideon petition and hear the case?
It's interesting. To take your questions in reverse. Do I think the court would respond to this? Sure, I do. I think that the vote wouldn't be unanimous. I think we'd end up with a 7-9 or 7-2 probably. There are two justices that think that the case was wrongly decided. They happen to be idiots. But, what is interesting about this court, I think, is in comparison to the 63 Warren court, is that, they proclaim themselves to be originalists, that they are ascribing the meaning that was intended by the writers of the Constitution and not using any other meaning, any other intention, for, let's say, congressional intention when it comes to a statute. And they're full of garbage. First of all, they're not in the original framers' heads. Those are long gone. Secondly, their heads are full of information that they've gathered unconsciously and consciously over their lifetimes, and they can't separate that from what they're doing. That's impossible. Implicit bias makes it that way. And so, if they were in fact originalists, we wouldn't be having such a proliferation of guns everywhere, because at that time, it was a musket. It wasn't an AK-15 available. So, I think that this court is less honest than courts of prior years. But the Warren court, with Warren, he strove to try to come to agreements with folks behind the scenes. And he was a politician, and, before he joined the court. Of course, he had practiced law, but he ultimately, was a politician in California. And I think he understood the inherent, human nature and politicking. And the court isn't absent that. But I do think that ultimately this court would entertain it. I think that the decision would not be unanimous.
It's interesting. I think, we accept that the fact that everybody's got a right to counsel today, like we never needed Gideon. And I just think it's important to remember that in Bob and my lifetime, maybe not yours. You seem a little younger than us. This case came down, and we didn't always have what we have today. And I just thought it was worth a mention.
It's a great case. It's a great case for listeners to read. It's a fascinating story of a man who did this himself. And I think those are inspiring stories and where great law comes from. There's a need, and it needs to be addressed.
And what about that other important anniversary? My cousin Vinny.
I loved my cousin Vinny. Utes. I loved my cousin Vinny. I really do. And as as somebody who was practicing law for I guess almost 20 years, I'm not practicing anymore. And I've devoted my work to other things. But I love watching those movies. I don't like the movies that try to make out law as a real thing, like they're trying to describe something in a real sort of fashion. But I love the comedy movies because those allow us to make fun of ourselves as lawyers, and we should make fun of ourselves as lawyers. But when they do these dramatic films, it's like, oh God, and I can't help but sit there and go, the jury box is on the wrong side of the room. I get sort of that hypercritical, if you're going to do it, at least get somebody on set who understands, what this is going to look like. If you really want to pull it over on somebody who's a lawyer, there's a lot of lawyers out there in California. I think there's 189,000 lawyers,
that's for sure.
So.
Did you ever use the argument, everything that guy said is bullshit?
In my head, I did.
That was his that was his opening argument in the movie. Anyway, on a more serious note, international law, Ukraine, accountability. We have Russia hammering Ukraine. We have the United States and the rest of the civilized world sitting around watching. They're making it difficult financially, I suppose. Sanctions have been levied. But as a relative of Holocaust survivors, I can't help feeling that we've seen the movie before and that never again isn't being fulfilled. Do you have any thoughts on what international law would say about the unprovoked attack on another country and the effect of this kind of behavior on the world?
This is a really hard subject. When I was in law school, a funny little joke that my law school professor used to tell, Keith Sealing, who's still alive and well and a good friend, would say that international law is just domestic law with accents. But when it comes to this situation, I place it in the context of bullying, truly. What we've done is we've allowed a bully to continue to bully because we're afraid of the bully. We're afraid of what the bully's going to do. And at that point, the bully is controlling everyone. If you're a NATO member, you get that protection under Article 5, where, an assault against one is an assault against all of the NATO members. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and so they're not getting that protection. So they're going around behind the scenes, if you will. All of the countries are producing, hey, here's some weapons, here's some strikers, here's some more drones, here's some missiles. And, we're doing it very loudly. But we are doing what we can without actually putting boots on the ground. Or putting planes in the air because we don't want to provoke the bully. Now, if the bully is going to press a button somewhere, the bully's going to press a button somewhere. And that's sort of my view. It comes from a workplace analogy. If you're going to be that afraid of what's happening to you, it's already happened to you. And so, what's the worst thing that can happen from that? And what happens if we don't do anything and, he gets frustrated and he presses the button anyway, because he's frustrated that he's not getting what he wants, that the Ukrainians are extraordinary in their unified stance of fighting. And there's a guy, Zelensky, who is, in my view, the epitome of a leader. I mean, he is marshaling his own people. He is marshaling the rest of the world to be responsive to a point. And I understand that behind the scenes, there's a lot of information that's being given, let's say, to President Biden. That these attacks are not coming from airplanes. These missiles are being launched not from the skies. So putting a no-fly zone is not something that is accurate. It's not going to resolve the missiles flying. It's just going to put planes against planes, and then we're going to end up having to shoot someone down. And so it is a complicated set of moving parts. I absolutely agree that if we don't stop him, who will? Because they're going to come for the next country. He's going to come for the next country. He's going to come for the next country. I think he sees this. There's no research into this. I mean, I think that Putin sees this as his sort of final last act, is he's going to put the USSR back together. And, he started with Ukraine thinking that he could make that happen. And he underestimated Zelensky. But if he can overwhelm Ukraine, he absolutely will move on to Poland. He will move on to another country. He certainly has Belarus in his pocket. So, I understand, how horrible this is for folks who have Holocaust survivors in their families, and they're just seeing history repeat itself. And simultaneously, we know what an absolute vicious person Putin is, and we don't really know. I mean, I don't know as an average citizen what's going on in this man's head. There's some talk that there's some health issues. So, do you want to provoke the guy who may in fact not have, his entire faculties at his disposal, and who might press a button somewhere? And we know that's not how really it works, but that he might press a button somewhere and implode the world. There's just, I'm glad that I don't sit in the Oval Office and have to make these decisions.
Me too.
I'm hoping out of NATO that there's going to be some more action.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Tracy. I mean, you talked about how vicious this guy is. We've seen the pictures of the attacks on civilians, hospitals, maternity hospitals, kindergartens, food distribution centers, for crying out loud, apartment buildings. First of all, I don't understand what he's gaining by that, except just because he is a bully and can show that he can do it, and so he's going to do it. But the question is, to me, isn't there some international law that can hold him to account once this is over with?
There's a war tribunal in The Hague, and there are rules of engagement when you engage in a conflict or a war. You're not supposed to be attacking civilian targets. His justification for that, of course, is that they're harboring military, that factory really is harboring military supplies. And it's not really a food distribution center. He operates by the Trump playbook, or Trump operated by the Putin playbook. It remains unclear. Maybe they share the same playbook, which is basically gaslight and lie. And you can justify your actions. But yes, there is a mechanism for doing this. The last time I think that this was attempted, the trial went on for years. And before they got to the end of the trial, I think, I'm trying to remember who it was, but he died before they got there. And to what point? To really what point? I think what we have to contend with here is do we want a regime change or not? And if it's a regime change, then how is that going to come about in a manner that doesn't result in mutual destruction of the planet?
Do you see a Nuremberg type tribunal being assembled to hold people like this accountable?
Yes, I do. I think there's enough outrage over what they're doing, over the fact that millions of Ukrainians have now left the country, that children have been sent by parents across the border. Here are border guards and taking these children and parents turning around, going back and creating Molotov cocktails and standing there practicing shooting weapons because they want to keep their country. I think that, when women, not that women need special protection, I want to be real clear here, but when you're attacking maternity hospitals, when you're attacking, children's hospitals,
Kindergartens.
kindergartens, you're genocide. You're looking to wipe out the Ukrainian people. And when you're purportedly kidnapping elderly people and forcibly deporting them or importing them, if you will, to Siberia, for what purpose? I'm not exactly sure. I hope we've got satellites over that looking for camps and the possibility of gas chambers. He's exterminating a population one way or another because he wants to put it together, but he also wants what's there, because what's there is really important.
Well, it seems like he's destroying what's there to me.
He's destroying these areas that are occupied, but or in other words, civilized, that are population centers. But it is a large expanse of land where the soil is very valuable, where there is a tremendous mineral deposits that we rely on to make, for example, telephones. There's a lot of stuff there, and that gives him the ability to improve his economy, right? If he can gain access to that, because we need those things and China needs those things. But I do think what drives this for him is that his last act is to put that country back together, because he did not agree with what had transpired when the USSR broke up and became Russia.
And he's been trying to change it ever since, apparently. At least in his mind.
Yes, he's an interesting.
Moving on, I want to talk about an issue that I know you're somewhat passionate about, and that's pardons. I listened to a podcast that you did about pardons, and every president does this, and I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, so his pardons were more particularly interesting to me. He pardoned Steve Bannon, who converted campaign funds for his own use. He pardoned Roger Stone, who was found guilty on 7 counts of criminal behavior, lying to Congress and obstructing a congressional investigation. He pardoned Michael Flynn, who sold out his country, for crying out loud. And you pointed out in your podcast that when Gavin Newsome had an opportunity to pardon someone, Leslie Van Houten, a former Manson family member who's now 72 years old and not a threat to society, he declined to do so. Do you see pardons as an equal justice issue? Is it a wealth issue? Is it a well-connected issue? How do we stop these types of pardons in the future?
Well, the only way that that you can restrain pardon power is to change the Constitution. Congress tried to change, pardons using a statute or a couple times over the years, and it was struck down as unconstitutional. And so the only real way to restrict pardon authority, I think, is using an amendment to the Constitution to clarify its purpose and when it's not okay. There's a few things about it where if it's done for the purposes of illegal, to help, hide your own illegal conduct. So in other words, the pardon itself becomes illegal because it becomes part of a common scheme or plan, let's say. To avoid accountability. That's something that isn't going to. That's something that can be utilized as a mechanism for holding the person who's issuing the pardon accountable, adjacent to something else. But generally speaking, pardon power it's sort of a gift. It's a gift to the person in the office, and we have trusted, and the framers trusted that we were going to be smart enough and astute enough and wise enough to elect people to office who were going to be good people that would have good judgment. And what we saw with Trump was that he somehow he got elected, and obviously was not that person. And we saw it exposed. It exposed, though, what was great about that presidency. And I try to view things in sort of the half glass full if I can. What was great about it was it exposed the flaws to the great American experiment that need to be addressed. And so there, I've often joked that I would love to see that instead of debates, screw those. What I want to see is I want to see every candidate on stage behind a little, school desk with a little test packet on civics. And I want a televised test where we watch them take it and we'll proctor it as Americans. Because I think you need to know what the Constitution says, and you need to be able to understand what the laws are and how the three co-equal branches of government work in order to be president. I think that's something we took for granted.
I like that.
This guy didn't understand any of that. He did what he did until he could to see if he could get away with it. People are so out of their minds upset that Biden isn't taking certain actions. And I have to, on Twitter, I'm very active, and I have to remind people, like, hey, you guys are so conditioned to seeing people do things that are unlawful and then watching the courts reverse them. President Biden wants to prevent that. He's not going to take action using executive order unless he's absolutely certain that he can withstand sort of scrutiny, because he doesn't want to throw the government back into that level of chaos. So getting back to the issue of pardons, it's a gift that's given to the executive, whether it be state or federal. And what happened with Stone and Bannon and Flynn, I mean, it was sort of the most egregious example. I remember back when Bush 2, he issued a pardon that people took objection to. When, President Clinton issued a pardon that people took objection to. But these were extraordinary. And unfortunately, there really isn't much that we can do about it. And inevitably, these folks were going to do something wrong again anyway. And and I'm sure that I even question whether the pardons that were issued whether they were lawful, in the sense that was the proper procedure followed? If there's an established internal procedure, was it followed?
Well, we mentioned never again in the context of the Holocaust. I think we could mention never again in the context of Trump as well. But be that as it may, the most infamous pardon, I think, in my lifetime was Jerry Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. But moving on, I'd like to get your thoughts on some recent high-profile jury verdicts, if that's okay.
Sure.
George Floyd, Derek Chauvin.
Absolutely the right verdict. And what Derek Chauvin did to Mr. Floyd was unconscionable, and frankly, he should have gotten the death penalty for that.
Ahmaud Arbery.
Absolutely unconscionable. Absolutely the right verdict. Mr. Arbery was hunted by these people, and I'm glad that the verdicts, both at the state and federal level, came out the way they did.
You think if had Arbery been white and the murderer had been black, that would have made any difference?
It would depend on the jury. It would depend on the facts. I would like to say that anybody who hunts someone down with a vehicle and engages in that kind of behavior would be held accountable.
Actually, that question's a better question to ask of this next one, and that's Kyle Rittenhouse. A black man walks down the street holding an AR-15, and the cops just let him go by. I can't help but think that the black man would have been shot down. But
that was the wrong decision. I am livid about that one. I'm also livid about the one Curtis Reeves, who was exonerated, where he shot a Chad Olson, who was a young guy at the movies with his wife, because Mr. Olson didn't turn his cell phone off when the previews were on, and this former police officer, former SWAT team director, he was in charge of establishing SWAT in that state, not surprisingly, Florida. he felt, that he was in danger. And so he pulled his gun out and shot him and killed him, and also shot the wife, Chad Olson's wife, and hit her ring finger that is permanently damaged. So the ring where her wedding ring was. Talk about forever impacted. It is those cases. It is the case of Rittenhouse. It is the case of Curtis Reeves. Those cases where people claim self-defense that are outrageous. Now, Rittenhouse is interesting because in Rittenhouse, it is arguable that the first person who was killed, that one may have been, in fact, a justifiable self-defense. But once you take your weapon and you run through the streets, a crowd, during sort of a chaotic situation, you say, hey, I just killed a guy. And then everybody rushes towards you to try to stop you, given our society today and the way that we've been so conditioned to be looking for mass shooters. At that point, the folks that he injured and that he killed, those were not justifiable self-defense. Okay, that was just not justifiable behavior. Now, I personally have feelings about AR-15s, and I don't think anybody needs to have one unless you're in the military. I think that kid, that child didn't belong where he was. I think that there should have been criminal responsibility for the business that facilitated that to happen. He needed to go back home and find something else to do. I don't think that we need these folks walking around making things more difficult for the police. I think the police were heading the direction where they thought there was the most risk. And that they saw this kid and he's not a problem. And he turned out to be a problem. And there was a lot of direct and implicit bias involved in those decisions. But absolutely the wrong decision. And I hope that there are consequences for this kid moving forward in some manner, because I still don't think he's learned his lesson.
You still don't think he's going to what?
That he's learned his lesson.
Oh, learned his lesson.
Yeah. He wanted his gun back.
Oh, definitely not. He's very arrogant about it. I agree with you. I don't think he's learned his lesson at all. Do you think if he was a black man, the same decision would have been rendered?
No, but I do think, that there was some performance that went on. I think his crying, had an impact. I think that, that the sort of the politics around it had an impact. But I think that ultimately, his whiteness certainly had an impact. And you see that all the time. I mean, the same thing goes for Curtis Reeves, his age, and the fact that he was a white guy. He got off with shooting somebody at point blank range inside a movie theater because somebody threw popcorn at his face after he got in his face to shut off his phone.
Your comments about self-defense anticipated my next question, so it's not necessary to ask it, but I do want to comment on the fact that a lot of attorneys who do what you and I used to do disagree with you and I about whether self-defense was an appropriate defense here, and agree that with the outcome of that case because of the self-defense argument. But I want to ask a different question, and that is, the defense attorneys were interviewed and asked why Rittenhouse testified in his own behalf, because most defendants don't. And they answered that they conducted a mock jury trial, and the results were clearly better with the mock if he testified. And I wrote a book. I just released a new book called You Have the Right to Remain Silent, and the book features a jury consultant helping a high-profile attorney build his client's defense. Do you have any opinions on jury consulting and its impact on trial results?
We'll get Dr. Tracy's response to that question when we come back after this message.
Sure. I think that jury consultants, hey, if that's the way you're going to make your money, more power to you. But I think that depending on what they're hired to do, that it's junk science. And the reason for this is that you literally have no idea what's going on in the juror's head and in their mind. I mean, you've tried cases, you've had jury cases, I've had jury cases. You have no idea what's going on in their heads. You really don't know all that much about them, and people are complex. They could dislike you because they don't like the type of clothing you wear. I mean, let's talk about Marcia Clark back in the O.J. Simpson case. I mean, and there's a whole lot of sexism and racism and all sorts of stuff wrapped up in all of that. And that was just a mess. I mean, to retry that case today and under different circumstances with the knowledge that we have today, I think the outcome would probably be different. But I have to hope. But
he got his.
Yeah, he did. Not the way he needed to. I think that there's doing a mock trial, testing things out, that's a reasonable thing to do. Most folks that I've talked to, for self-defense, you need to put the defendant on the stand. In my cases, it was always my client's decision. It wasn't my decision. I would say, hey, I think it's not advisable. The only time where that deviated was when I had a case and the client wanted to testify in his own defense, and I knew he was going to lie. And I stood up, and this was actually a bench trial. And I said, Your Honor, so-and-so would like to tell you what he thinks. And then I sat down. And that, in my state, was the universal sign for my client's about to lie. And I can't facilitate that. And the client said all he was going to say and got cross-examined. And of course, I, objected when appropriate, but I wasn't going to facilitate it. And, I'm not sure how often that happens with most lawyers, but I've had that experience a couple times. But I don't think that jury consultants, really add that much to it. Lawyers are smart. Most lawyers are smart. They know what they need to do. This is about making the elements. I mean, I've been watching this other case right now, this USL trial. I don't know if you're familiar. It's this doctor who is alleged to have killed 14 patients by overdosing them on fentanyl. They were in ICU. And the question was, did he kill them, or was it comfort care? And I believe it's out of Ohio. And I got to tell you, I'm watching these lawyers, and lawyers don't pay attention to how they are perceived. Never mind their client. You have to be likable. Your client needs to be likable. You have to find a reason for why the jury wants to find in your favor. These are basic concepts that we were taught in our first couple years of law school. And it seems like we don't need to pay jury consultants to do that. It's just that they don't understand this. I mean, I'm watching, prosecutors scream, at witnesses because obviously there's COVID restrictions and glass and things like that. But that has an impact. I'm looking at the way people are dressed. I'm looking at the way they're carrying themselves. I'm watching the backbiting going between the two lawyers. Jurors are sitting there watching this thing. They're stuck there, indentured servitude. And many of them don't want to be there. This case in particular is very difficult. It's very complex and it's very scientific. And that stuff just adds to animosity that might already be present towards one side or the other.
It's got to be painful to watch, I would think.
Yeah, it's painful for me to watch. I got to watch it as part of what I do as a legal analyst. And I'm watching it. I'm like, why are these two fighting with each other? What are they doing?
So you think that one of my favorite shows, Bull, is Bull, right?
I think that it's a great place to spend money if you've got it. But I am telling you that I don't think that stuff is particularly helpful when it comes to trying to figure out what's in a juror's head. I mean, I'm more valuable to you in explaining how implicit bias works and how you can make that part of your advantage. You know, I wrote an article recently about how bias is everywhere and everybody's got it. And the trial system is really about maximizing, bias to your advantage. And we all do it. And anybody who says that the trial system or our legal system is neutral, that there's neutrality there, is wrong. Because we are part of the legal fiction. We're good soldiers as lawyers. We say this is a neutral process, this is a fair process. There's such a thing as justice. There's fairness. No, there isn't. There isn't, because of bias.
So you don't think that justice is equal black and white, right?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you this, and this, Mark, this is not on your little cheat sheet, but
you can ask anything you want, my friend.
Have the confirmation hearings for Judge Jackson illustrated any of this?
Here's what those are triggering to watch, and I got to tell you, I've only been able to watch it in bursts.
Yeah.
In an employment context, it really matters what you call something, in order for it to be justifiable behavior. So if you say that something is, I'll give you an example. If you say it's supervision, okay, then it's a legitimate business activity and therefore not discriminatory. Here, what we watched was 23 and a half, I think, hours of bullying of a Black woman who has more credentials than any Supreme Court justice that has ever been up for confirmation. And she had to sit there because of stereotypical views of Black women and sit there and say, I've already answered your question. Whereas if I were sitting there, I might have been able to say, excuse me, hold up, stop talking. I'm still a federal judge. You're not going to speak to me that way. And if you continue to speak to me that way, I'm going to leave.
Interesting. It's a no-win situation.
She was just abused. There's just no doubt about it. And the people that did the abusing are scum, in my opinion.
They are scum, and it should have been stopped.
Yeah.
The behavior should have been stopped. I don't know why. I do know why. Durbin should have shut the mic off, but he didn't. And here's why: because the footage for campaigning at midterms is going to be phenomenal.
Oh yeah. All those ads will be out with clips from that stuff in there.
Lindsey Graham has lost his mind. I'm convinced that like after, I don't know if McCain balanced him out and he was always this Nazi, but he is really crazy.
Oh, he's crazy.
And I hate using that term because it's derogatory, and connected to people with legitimate mental health issues, but literally he's crazy. And this, why are you berating this woman, and talking and asking her questions about her faith? What the heck is wrong with you?
Yeah.
He also confirmed her for the position she currently holds.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I just don't understand the duplicity. You mentioned implicit bias, and I know that's one of your pet themes, if you will. It extends to all walks of life, right?
It is everywhere.
It's not. You can't get a good education. You can't establish credit. You can't buy a car. You can't buy a home. You can't live in a safe neighborhood. You can't get a fair trial, equal opportunity to well-paying jobs. In some part of this country, you can't even safely drive a car if you're a person of color. We're still a good old white boy country, are we not?
Implicit bias is relative. And so, depending on where we are in the country, if we were all in the same room, I would have less credibility and authority and power than you two. If even among white people, and so depending on what your identity character makeup is, if you're a cisgender white male straight, sort of Anglo-Saxon stereotypical male, middle-aged, you're golden most of the time. If you're anything other than that, it really is a matter of relativity. So, if you're black and straight, you're better than being black and gay. And add male and female into all of that. I mean, you just start, you can sit there for hours and figure this stuff out and ordering it. But it's everywhere. And so the issue here is to accept that it's everywhere. And the way that, and you described it sort of a pet project, my dissertation was about implicit bias in workplace investigations. And I did a study that proved that it exists, and is very much real, even though we call them neutral. But what's interesting is that you can mitigate for it.
So you're a doctor of implicit bias.
No. Right? I'm a doctor of education with a law degree. And I point that out. I do. I know we're teasing each other. I point that out because sometimes when I write my name, people like to mansplain me and tell me that's not how you write it when you have a JD. And I say, it isn't. And I have another doctorate on top of that, and then they want to tell me how to write that too. But the issue here is being able to recognize it, and the way that to accept that it exists. And generally speaking, I've watched this happen in classes where we've taught it, where it's been taught, where people who are in that sort of majority, who are white males, sit there and get upset when they're told that they have privilege and that there's bias. What? No, not me. No. I'm the least racist person that sort of thing. And it's actually a scientific thing. It's actually your brain doing something. Your brain is doing two processes simultaneously, and it is doing them in a way. Old software, old hardware needs an upgrade, and it's not your fault. And so if you can understand how implicit bias happens in your brain and understand that it's a function of how your brain works, it's a survival mechanism that goes all the way back to when we were trying to avoid tigers, then you stand a fighting chance in getting someone's attention and being able to change their viewpoint on it and getting them to think differently about it. But
we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
Is it as simple as, white is good, black is bad? Straight is good, gay is bad. Men are good, women are bad. I mean, is that what we are? Is that who we are as a society?
Not necessarily. I think that folks in marginalized populations would disagree with me on this, but it happens with let's say with Black people. Some Black people, are really, really, upset with white people. And then what happens is someone like me comes along and they say, wait a minute, but I'm not that person. And they go, oh no, you need to understand. And I'm like, wait a minute, aren't you judging me based on a stereotype? Why are you judging me based on a stereotype? And why is it wrong for me to correct you on that? Everybody has it. And it is a function of life experience. I've reconciled with what happens to me at certain times. When I was in grad school, I remember crossing the street. When I saw someone approaching, it was dark. I just inherently did it, and it goes back to an experience I had when I was much younger, where I was almost assaulted. And so these are sort of learned behaviors. They're taught behaviors. If your parents taught you that Black people are bad, of course, it's that for you. But I think that what happens here is that the brain is doing two things. It's doing pattern detection and probability determination. It is trying to put things in boxes. And so it goes to the simplest denominator. If you're male and Black, it goes into the box of bad, if that's what you've been taught. And then probability determination. What do I do with this? How do I protect you from this? And what should the body do? Run, stay, fight, what? Reject. And so it's doing those two things simultaneously. And so it's so incredibly fast that you're not discerning it. And the people that you confront about it, they don't recognize it because they don't perceive it. But there were studies done that show that that babies as young as 6 months old had racial preference. And so, when they asked the question the other day, do you think babies are racist? Well, technically, yes. There were 2 studies done in Toronto. But it has to do with exposure, how much exposure you have to different types of people, what you're taught about those different types of people, what the messaging is about those different types of people, and being able to think critically, and to recognize when you're doing it, and to give agency to people to say, hey, wait a minute, I think you're too quick to judge. When you get older, you that's sort of the idea that, hey, look, if you hear me being biased, could you tell me? Because I don't know. And I may not recognize it. When I heard Senator Kennedy say, you're so articulate, I wanted to punch him in the face. Like literally, like we all know that as a Black trope. Okay, that, they're articulate, right? So because otherwise they wouldn't be, right? It's a microaggression. Was he not aware, or was he playing on it for his base? I mean, if he didn't know, he needs to know. And somebody should have called him on that during the hearing. And that was part of the problem.
How disrespectful can you be? It just drives me crazy. The pushback on what we were just talking about is we've become too woke.
What the hell does that mean?
Woke.
I don't know what that word means either. I when I was looking at the list of topics, I was like, I don't know what woke means. I know it's used as a derogatory term and thrown at me because I'm a Democrat and smart. But the fact that I am aware of things, the fact that I'm educated about things, I guess that means I'm woke. The fact that I understand that there is discrimination in the world, and that I have privilege as a white woman, depending on the circumstances, I guess that means I'm woke. Do you want to walk through life asleep? Is my response.
That's a good question.
Yeah, really.
That's a good question.
I'd rather be awoke than be asleep. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, well, there's one other thing, though, maybe we should try to hit on before we let you go, Dr. Tracy, and that is abortion.
Sure, I've got time. Please.
We got all these state laws that a lot of these southern states are trying to put through, and a bunch of them hinge on what the Supreme Court will do with Roe v. Wade. Now, what do you think is going to happen with that?
Roberts doesn't want the court to be politicized. He is working really hard for that not to happen.
Can I stop you? Can I stop you a second? I want to ask that a different way.
Okay.
What do you see the constitutional arguments in these cases on both sides of that issue?
Well, I mean,
do you see a constitutional argument for abortion?
They made one in Roe and then all of its progeny, which is that you have a right to privacy. And inherently there's a right to privacy and body autonomy. I think your ability to sort of control your destiny. There's the other argument on the other side, which is this is a life, and when does life begin? And everybody has this right to live to a life, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which is really not the Constitution. But was it Marsha Blackman needed some instruction on that on Twitter this morning when she made her little quote about abortion. But it is a very thorny problem. Take the religion out of it, in that it impacts really only one sex. Now, my view about, I'm going to deviate a little bit here and just say that my view about this is that if you want to enact all these laws, that's fine. But child support starts the day of conception and you start paying. Because if I have to carry the burden of that child that I didn't want and that you don't want to take care of, that's going to fall on me, then we should impose the same sort of obligations from that day one. That would change people's minds real quickly. But when it comes to these this issue. The science behind it is important. They got the science wrong. The Dobbs case recently that was argued. The men on the court couldn't calculate pregnancy properly. Those weeks are not calculated properly. The people who made those statutes don't understand how to calculate it. And so that the doctors are calculating it one way, and they seem to think that it's calculated another way. And so agenda driven that they don't have any interest in learning about it. What I don't understand, and what I really want to know, is why these old men in Texas and in everywhere else where this is happening, what is your interest in me having a child? What is it? What is your interest in this? Because if it's, where will they send their mistresses for abortion if they can't get one in state? Because they're not living the life that they proclaim, many of them. I mean, how many politicians have we seen over the years? And it just seems like they're creating this utopia idea of the way life, should be or was, what they believed it was when it never was. People were still having abortions. They were having unsafe abortions.
You mentioned religion, and I think that plays a part, at least. Maybe just subconsciously it plays a part.
But why do they care about? I'm not ascribing to your religion. John Roberts doesn't want to politicize the court. As far as the cases that I have heard so far, I do think there's a possibility of a plurality where the law remains in place. That he somehow finagles a plurality, and it doesn't change the law in place, but it shifts the law. The dicta will shift sort of the law moving forward. And so that's a possibility. But these cases that if in case of an ectopic pregnancy, no right to an abortion. So in other words, the mother is okay to be sacrificed, but so is the baby going to die too. So those types of statutes are going to get completely flipped. I mean, those are just performative. But where we're trying to shift is when can the state step in on regulating, and this nonsense with turning people into bounty hunters. I mean, can we turn moms and dads who have lost their kids, to mass shootings into bounty hunters too? Because I'm okay with that. If you're okay with the whole bounty hunter abortion thing, I'm okay with us all coming after the people who are killing these kids.
But I want to thank you for joining us today on Justice Counts. It was really informative and fascinating. And Mark Bello and I are very grateful that you took the time to be with us. And thank you everybody for listening to this discussion. Meanwhile, if you haven't done so already, please check out Mark Bello's Ripped from the Headlines legal thrillers, all available on Amazon and other major online booksellers. He has quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, who fights for justice on all fronts. His books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, Betrayal at the Border, and his latest, You Have the Right to Remain Silent. For more information, just check out markmbello.com. Until next time, this is Bob Gaddy for Mark Bello signing off from Justice Counts.